Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales of extraordinary courage, compassion, and the bonds that unite us. Today, we bring you the inspiring story of Ranger, a German shepherd who went from being overlooked as a police dog to uncovering one of the largest wildlife trafficking networks in history. With his handler, Officer Ben Carter, Ranger showed the world that even the smallest actions can create ripples of change. Join us as we explore their journey, a story of trust, resilience, and a mission to protect the vulnerable. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's tale of heroism and hope. The sun had barely risen over the sprawling expanse of the port of Los Angeles when Ranger began his morning patrol. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of salt water and diesel fuel, as rows of towering shipping containers stretched endlessly across the docks. Ranger, a 7-year-old German shepherd, moved with practiced precision, his dark fur glistening with morning dew. At his side, Officer Ben Carter, his handler and closest companion, watched with quiet pride. Ranger wasn't an ordinary detection dog. From the moment Ben met him at the Police Dog Academy 5 years earlier, he knew there was something different about him, while the other young dogs eagerly bounded about, full of energy and enthusiasm. Ranger had been calm and observant, his intelligent amber eyes taking in every detail around him. "He's different," the trainer had said at the time, almost as a warning. Not every handler wants a dog that thinks too much. Most prefer ones that just follow orders. Ben had chuckled at that. "Then he's perfect for me," he replied. "Because I think too much too." Their partnership had blossomed from that first meeting, built on mutual respect and understanding. Ranger wasn't just a dog that followed commands, he was a partner who worked alongside Ben as if they shared a common purpose. Over the years, they had developed an unspoken language, a connection that didn't require words. This morning, as Ranger trotted ahead, his nose working diligently, Ben found himself reflecting on their journey together. He often spoke to Ranger during their early patrols, sharing his thoughts about work, his worries about his aging mother back home, and even his frustrations with the bureaucratic challenges of their job. Ranger would listen intently, occasionally pressing his nose into Ben's hand or leaning against him, offering a silent kind of reassurance. But today, something was different. Ben noticed it almost immediately. Ranger's usual steady pace had quickened. His body language tense, his tail stiffened, his neck arched, and his nose moved furiously, circling a particular shipping container. Ben stopped in his tracks, his heart beginning to race. In their years of working together, he had learned to trust Ranger's instincts implicitly. "Ranger, what is it?" he murmured, moving closer. Ranger responded with a low whine, his amber eyes meeting Ben's with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. His paws began to scratch lightly at the metal surface of the container, his body language conveying a clear message: "There's something in here." Ben's hand moved instinctively to his radio. "This is Officer Carter," he said, his voice steady but edged with tension. "I need backup at Dock 14. Possible contraband in container 574. As he waited for the response, dock workers began to take notice, pausing in their duties to watch. Many of them knew Ranger by name, having seen him in action over the years. He was something of a local legend, featured in news stories about his exceptional detection work. But even they could sense that this moment was different. When the backup team arrived, led by Senior Inspector Lisa Green, the atmosphere grew taut with anticipation. Lisa had worked with Ben and Ranger on numerous occasions and trusted their partnership implicitly. "What's he got?" she asked, her voice low but serious. "Something big," Ben replied, his eyes never leaving Ranger. It's not his usual alert. His, more intense this time. The process of opening a shipping container was always meticulous, requiring documentation and multiple witnesses. As the heavy doors creaked open, a peculiar, musty odor wafted out, hitting Ben's nose and making him wince. Years of experience told him this wasn't an ordinary case. Inside, the container was packed with burlap sacks, neatly stacked in rows. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable. But Ranger's agitation only grew. His whines turned almost mournful as he moved toward a specific set of sacks. His nose pressed firmly against them. "Easy, boy," Ben murmured, placing a comforting hand on Ranger's back. The shepherd briefly leaned into him before resuming his focused stance. Every muscle in his body taut with purpose. The forensics team began opening the sacks Ranger had indicated. And what they found left everyone stunned. Beneath the layers of dried materials were pangolin scales, thousands of them, representing a heartbreaking number of slaughtered animals. Ben felt his stomach churn as he looked at the pile of scales, the weight of what they had uncovered settling over him. But Ranger wasn't finished. He moved to another section of the container, his behavior just as insistent. When the team followed his lead, they uncovered something even more extraordinary: waterproof pouches filled with documents. As one of the forensics specialists carefully opened a pouch, their face paled. "These aren't just shipping manifests," they said, their voice tinged with disbelief. "These are operational details, payment records, contact lists, routes. This is their entire playbook." The realization hit Ben like a wave. This wasn't just a wildlife trafficking bust, it was the key to dismantling an entire network. And it was all because of Ranger's instincts. His unwavering focus. As the magnitude of the discovery sank in, Ben knelt beside Ranger, scratching behind his ears. "Good boy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Ranger looked up at him, his intelligent eyes filled with something that felt like understanding. In that moment, Ben realized that Ranger wasn't just his partner. He was a force for good, a protector of the vulnerable, and a reminder of what it meant to fight for something greater than yourself. The discovery inside the container was just the beginning. The documents Ranger had led them to were unlike anything Ben had ever encountered in his years on the job. Payment records, shipping routes, and contact lists painted a chilling picture of a sophisticated wildlife trafficking network spanning multiple countries. Senior Inspector Lisa Green stood beside Ben, her face grim as she flipped through the pages. "This is extraordinary," she murmured, holding up one of the documents. "This isn't just another smuggling operation. They've practically handed us their entire organization." Ben glanced down at Ranger, who was sitting alert at his side, his amber eyes scanning the scene as if ensuring everything was under control. "It's all thanks to you, buddy," Ben said softly, scratching Ranger behind the ears. The news traveled quickly. Within hours, higher authorities arrived at the port, their expressions growing more serious with each update. The evidence was so substantial that it warranted an immediate expansion of the investigation. Detective Claire Morgan, a veteran from the U.S. Wildlife Crimes Task Force, was called in to lead the case. Ben had worked with her once before and respected her meticulous approach. "Good work, Carter," Claire said, offering a rare smile as she crouched down to greet Ranger. "And you, Ranger, you've just made history." Ranger gave a small wag of his tail, leaning into her hand briefly before resuming his focused demeanor. Ben couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. The container was sealed again for transportation to a secure location where the evidence could be processed. Meanwhile, the documents uncovered inside had already provided their first lead, a warehouse in Long Beach that appeared to be a major hub for the trafficking operation. "We need to move carefully," Claire said as the team gathered to discuss their next steps. "This isn't just about shutting down a warehouse. If we do this right, we can dismantle the entire network. But if we make a mistake, they'll vanish before we have a chance to stop them." Ben nodded, his hand resting on Ranger's back. "Ranger and I are ready," he said simply. That night, the team began surveillance of the Long Beach warehouse. It was an unassuming building, tucked among a cluster of industrial facilities, with no outward signs of the horrors it concealed. From an unmarked van parked nearby, Ben and Ranger took their positions, watching the warehouse under the cover of darkness. The hours dragged on. But Ben didn't mind. He and Ranger had spent countless nights like this, waiting patiently for the right moment to act. What set this apart was the weight of what was at stake. At around 2 a.m., Ranger's ears perked up, his posture shifting subtly. Ben followed his partner's gaze to the warehouse entrance, where a truck had just pulled up. Workers began unloading crates with practiced efficiency, their movements too smooth to be anything but rehearsed. Movement at the southeast entrance. Ben whispered into his radio. The team observed silently, documenting everything. Each person's role was noted, from the driver to the workers inside the warehouse. Claire's voice came through the radio a few moments later. "This isn't just a drop-off," she said. "This is a distribution hub. They're sorting and organizing for larger shipments." Ranger's focus never wavered, even as the minutes stretched into hours. His attention remained locked on the activity below. Ben marveled at his partner's patience and determination. By the time the sun began to rise, the team had gathered enough evidence to confirm their suspicions. Claire's voice was steady as she issued the order. "We're planning the raid for tomorrow at dawn. Be ready." The next day, the team gathered in the pre-dawn light, their faces a mix of determination and tension. Ben knelt beside Ranger, stroking his fur as they waited for the signal. "This is it, boy," he said quietly. "Let's finish what we started." At precisely 5:43 a.m., the raid began. The tactical team moved swiftly, breaking through the warehouse doors with precision. Shouts of "Police! Don't move!" echoed through the building as workers scrambled in confusion. Ranger led the way, his nose guiding the team through rows of shelves stacked high with contraband. The scale of the operation was staggering: pangolin scales, ivory, and other illegal wildlife products filled the space. In the chaos, several suspects tried to flee but were quickly apprehended. Meanwhile, Ranger's behavior shifted. He began scratching at the floorboards in a back office, his actions deliberate and precise. "What's he got?" Claire asked, hurrying over. Ben crouched beside Ranger, pulling up the floorboards to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside were phones, USB drives, and more documents, evidence that would prove invaluable in unraveling the entire network. "Good boy," Ben said, his voice filled with pride. Ranger pressed his nose into Ben's hand briefly before resuming his work, as if knowing the job wasn't done yet. As the raid continued, the scale of the operation became even more apparent. Ranger led Ben and the team to a small room at the back of the warehouse. His demeanor changed noticeably, his movements were cautious, his nose working quickly but gently. Ben recognized the shift immediately. "He's found something," he said quietly. When the team opened the door, the sight inside left them momentarily stunned. 3 live pangolins were huddled in a makeshift cage, their scales dull and brittle, their bodies weak from stress and malnourishment. The room was cramped and dark, the air thick with the smell of neglect. "Jesus," Claire murmured, stepping forward to assess the situation. They were keeping them as samples for buyers. Ranger approached the cage slowly, his head lowered and his movements deliberate. He let out a soft whine, sitting just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on the animals as if he understood their suffering. Ben knelt beside him, his voice gentle. "It's okay, boy. We'll take care of them." Wildlife rescue specialists were quickly called in to handle the pangolins. As they carefully removed the animals from the cage, Ranger remained seated, watching their every move. His presence was calm, almost protective, as if he knew the pangolins needed reassurance. One of the rescue workers, a young woman named Kelly, paused to watch Ranger. "He's remarkable," she said softly. "Most dogs would be barking or agitated. But him, it's like he knows they've been through enough." Ben smiled faintly, his hand resting on Ranger's back. "He's always had a way of understanding," he said. The raid's success made headlines almost immediately. By the time the sun was fully up, news outlets were reporting on the staggering discovery, a massive cache of illegal wildlife products, live pangolins rescued, and a trove of evidence that could dismantle a global trafficking network. Ranger, however, remained blissfully unaware of the attention. As always, his focus was on the task at hand. Even as the scene around him buzzed with activity, suspects being taken into custody, evidence being catalogued, officials arriving to assess the operation, Ranger stayed close to Ben, his eyes scanning the area as if ensuring nothing was missed. Back at the temporary command center, Claire and her team began piecing together the information uncovered during the raid. The documents Ranger had found beneath the floorboards were a goldmine, detailing not just the warehouse's operations but its connections to a web of traffickers across multiple countries. "This is going to take months to untangle," Claire said, her tone a mix of exhaustion and determination. "But we've got them. Thanks to you too." Ben glanced at Ranger, who was lying at his feet, his head resting on his paws but his ears still alert. "We're just doing our job," Ben said, though he couldn't hide the pride in his voice. In the weeks that followed, the case quickly grew into an international operation. Arrests were made in multiple countries, and the evidence collected at the Long Beach warehouse became the cornerstone of prosecutions against some of the trafficking network's top players. Through it all, Ranger's role remained at the forefront. His actions during the investigation became a symbol of hope, not just for those working in wildlife protection but for the public at large. One particularly touching moment came during a press conference held to update the public on the case. As Claire addressed reporters, Ranger sat calmly beside Ben, his quiet presence drawing as much attention as the details of the investigation. "This case is a reminder," Claire said, her voice firm. "A reminder that even in the darkest corners of human greed and cruelty, there are those who stand up to protect the vulnerable. And sometimes, those protectors come in the form of a loyal dog with an extraordinary nose and an even bigger heart." The room erupted in applause, and Ranger looked up at Ben as if seeking reassurance. Ben leaned down, whispering, "Good boy, Ranger. You've earned every bit of this." As the investigation progressed, Ranger and Ben became frequent visitors to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where the rescued pangolins were being cared for. The youngest of the three, nicknamed Lucky by the staff, seemed particularly drawn to Ranger. "It's incredible," Kelly said one afternoon as she watched Lucky approach the front of his enclosure to greet Ranger. "Pangolins are naturally shy, especially around predators like dogs. But with Ranger, it's like he knows he's safe." Ben watched the interaction with a mix of awe and quiet pride. "Ranger has always been good at reading others," he said. "Doesn't matter if they're human or not." Over time, the pangolins began to recover, their once dull scales regaining their natural sheen, their movements more confident. Watching their progress became a source of comfort for Ben and Ranger, a reminder of why they did what they did. As the trial of the trafficking network's leaders began, Ben and Ranger were called to testify. The courtroom was packed, the case drawing international attention. The evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution's case was airtight. But for Ben, the most poignant moments came during the victim impact statements. Representatives from conservation organizations and affected communities spoke about the devastating effects of wildlife trafficking. Ben felt Ranger press against his leg as if sensing the weight of the testimonies. When the verdict was finally delivered, 15 years in prison for each of the kingpins, along with substantial fines for wildlife conservation efforts, Ben leaned down to Ranger, his voice barely a whisper. "We did it, buddy. We made a difference." The legacy of their work extended far beyond the courtroom. Ranger's actions inspired new policies, educational campaigns, and even changes to how detection dogs were selected and trained. And though Ranger didn't seek recognition, his story touched the hearts of people around the world, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery could create ripples of change. The partnership between Ben and Ranger was more than just a working relationship, it was a testament to the power of trust, empathy, and unwavering dedication to a cause greater than oneself. As the sun set over the port of Los Angeles, Ranger and Ben took one last walk together before the German Shepherd's well-earned retirement. The legacy of their work was visible everywhere, from the thriving pangolins at the rehabilitation center to the new policies inspired by their groundbreaking case. Ranger's instincts and dedication had not only dismantled a global trafficking network but had also ignited a movement for wildlife protection. Visitors to the Wildlife Crime Education Center often paused at the statue of Ranger. Its plaque reading, "To Ranger," who reminded us that courage and compassion transcend species. For Ben, the statue was a symbol of everything Ranger had taught him, not just about the job but about life itself, the value of trust, empathy, and standing up for those who cannot protect themselves. In his final days of active service, Ranger trained younger detection dogs, passing on the skills and heart that had defined his career. Though his pace had slowed, his spirit remained unwavering, inspiring new generations to continue the fight against wildlife crime. This is Ranger's story, a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Loved this story? Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales. And don't forget to share how this story touched your heart in the comments below.